prisons in communist China, which helped to cool off that last hot spot in those torrid waters of the Straits of Formosa. So at least the United Nations up to this hour has helped to prevent the beginning of that Third World War. And while it was doing this more dramatic thing, quietly from day to day, month to month, year to year, it's been pounding away at the very foundations of strengthening peace in the world by great campaigns, quiet campaigns, through the Food and Agriculture Administration and the World Health Organization and UNESCO and the International Labor Organization, carrying on what William James of Harvard would call the moral equivalent of war in great campaigns against poverty, against hunger, against illiteracy, against disease, against colonialism, and against the war system itself. Your organization, the great Food and Agricultural Organization, which has its headquarters in Rome, is teaching people how to make better use of the soil, how to have better seeds, so that they will produce more, and the millions and the hundreds of millions even who go to bed hungry at night will have a better chance to have a little more food. And I think we lick totalitarian tyranny and communism in the world more, though I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that we need to be strong in an age of danger. But for the long run, we will win the way for freedom more through food and health and education, much as the short way of being strong in armaments meantime. So the United Nations has helped to prevent the Third World War in these last 10 years and is building at the very foundations to remove the causes of war and to remove the seeds of people turning to tyranny instead of the slower ways of freedom and democracy. And so as we see the world 25,000 miles around lean up against this little infant organization, we have hopes in our heart. And we have hopes in our heart because more and more, through such organizations as yours, and through our great religious communions, we are beginning to really, not just with our lips, but in our hearts, say that all men are brothers, regardless of their color, or their creed, or their economic condition. You know, more than half the people of the world live in Asia. 200 million more live in Africa. 2/3 of the people of the world are colored. And one of the great blocks to a common front of freedom in the world today is the resentment of colored peoples against the preconception of the innate superiority of white peoples. Now, God made all peoples, and He's no respecter of persons. And through His great mission to the world, the fatherhood of one God and the brotherhood of all peoples, one of the great resources of the United Nations, on which it leans as the world leans up against the United Nations, the United Nations leans up against this spiritual conception of the fatherhood of one God and the brotherhood of all peoples. And so we are developing a sense of the community of man, the family of man, and the community of faith this spiritual conception that we're all children of one God around this earth. And we have the community of faith and the community of man, and more we're having the community of freedom. And the peoples of the East have looked west, both in fear and hope, as to whether the people of the West, and particularly the people of the United States, really believe in freedom. During a recent fear, almost hysteria, with all our responsibility to see that we protect the freedom and integrity of our institutions against subversion and treason and espionage and sabotage. We should not, in making sure of our freedom, lose our freedom. And we should make it clear to the peoples of the East as they look toward the West that we really believe in freedom. Not simply in our Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, but in our everyday regard for the rights of people to speak their own minds in any lawful assembly, in any difference of opinion, as a part of the historic tradition for which our American Revolution was fought. And we, in this particular age, as the world leans up against the United Nations, and the United Nations leans up against this spiritual conception of the family of man and the hopes of peoples, we know that in the last 500 years there have been three great revolutions which have tied the world together. And all of these revolutions came out of a mechanism. And the mechanism came out of an idea in the free minds of men. One was the idea of the power of electromagnetism. That idea in the mind of a scholar was made into a machine, the electromagnetic compass. For thousands of years, trade had been confined to the rivers or the land or the interior seas, or at most to the coastlines of the great continents. And just 500 years ago, there came into the world this little magnetic needle. An idea became a mechanism. The mechanism became a great commercial revolution, which discovered America, rounded Africa to India and Indonesia, became the channel through which peoples traveled and goods were exchanged all around the world, where the wheat and the cotton of America went into the markets of the world as a part of the commercial interdependence of the world. Then 500 years after that, or 400 years after that rather, another idea, the idea of the power of latent heat. Heat applied to water makes steam. The expansive power of steam put behind a piston became the great power engine. An idea became an engine. The engine worked a great industrial revolution and tied the world interdependently together. So that in 1914, what kind of a world were we living in? Now we thought, because we were behind the two great oceans, that we were isolated from the world. And yet we were living in the kind of a world in 1914 when a Slavic boy in a remote village in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in a place I never heard of, pulled a trigger. I don't mean to say the pull of that trigger caused the First World War, but I do mean to say that we were living in the kind of a world in which the pull of a trigger would release such pent-up forces, psychological, economic, nationalistic, militaristic, that in less than 4 years, 2 million American boys had crossed an ocean, and 10 million of the finest youth of this earth lay dead, killed, on the battlefields of 3 continents. That's the kind of a world we were living in. For more than 100 years, we had lived in splendid isolation, but we had come into the kind of a world where even the oceans couldn't keep us out of the world or keep the world out of us. We could not be isolated from the oceans around, the skies above, or the continents beyond. And then came the third revolution, 10 years ago. An idea. And you know, the people who beat totalitarian tyranny, a lot of them were German people who slipped away from Hitler. And one of them was a German woman, and he tried to catch her and not let her get out of Germany, because he found out she had an idea in her head, not on a piece of paper, not in a mechanism, just an idea in that German woman's head. And she was determined that it would not be used by totalitarian fascist tyranny. And she went to Copenhagen to find a great Scandinavian scientist, one of the great atomic scientists of our age, Niels Bohr, of the University of Copenhagen. And he had gone to give his mind to America. And she got the idea to him at Princeton University, and he gave it to President Roosevelt, and President Roosevelt put aside $2 billion to bring in the atomic age. And it was an idea not just of that woman, but of Italian scientists, British scientists, Scandinavian scientists, French scientists, German scientists, American scientists, all gathered here, many of them as refugees, to pool their intellectual power on the side of freedom against tyranny. Now the question has arisen, shall this new atomic power, which came out of the minds of those men and women in our time 10 years ago, shall it be used for the suicide of the human race, or for making a more productive and fairer and more beautiful world? Fortunately, in the very year in which atomic power was born, in the very year there was also born the United Nations, which gives the best hope that this tremendous power of the broken atom will be used out of the uranium of South Dakota, where you, in the decades ahead, are coming into the possession of one of the greatest resources in the history of man. A great Indian scientist at the Geneva conference said significantly, we, the people of India, if we tried to reach the material well-being of the United States, it would exhaust all our power resources in 10 years without atomic power. But with atomic power, we can skip ahead of the Industrial Revolution into the great atomic revolution and produce the food and the goods, the good things of this life in the great society made possible by the United Nations. So, Madam Chairman, as I come to a close here, in the presence of these people who in God's providence cooperate with the sun and the rain and the soil to produce those things by which men live and are clothed and are sheltered all over the world. We pray that the uranium of South Dakota will play its great part in cooperation with the United Nations for making a fairer and a more peaceful world, and that our America will more and more become a place where there'll always be the freedom to struggle for a higher freedom, where the answer to error is not terror, where the response to a difference in color and race and creed and economic condition is not intimidation, discrimination, or exploitation, where we would develop a democracy without vulgarity and excellence without arrogance, where and when men are free, the way of progress is not subversion, the respect for the past is not reaction, and the hope of the future is not violent revolution, where the majority is without tyranny, the minority without fear, and all people have the hopes of struggling together for a freer and fairer world. May the people of this yet young republic, descendants of all the colors and races and creeds and cultures and hopes of mankind, and in possession of the mightiest resources ever entrusted in the providence of God to any people, may we, the people of America, in friendly cooperation with all peoples, so use our power and our hopes and our religion and our democracy that we will rise to the responsibility of our power and the opportunity for our greatness to give fresh hopes to stricken peoples, give the hopes of food and freedom to stricken peoples around this earth through the cooperation of the United Nations in the great human pilgrimage, in that eternal adventure toward the kingdom of God, who made of one blood all the nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth.
Thank you very, very kindly, Dr. Graham, for your talk of sincerity.
Out of the very sincerest and deepest belief that President Harry Truman, in the selection of Leon Kaiserling as his chief economic advisor, brought to his aid and brought to his elbow one of the most profound and far-sighted individuals that any president has ever had standing at his side in good or bad times throughout all of our history. I say to you of my own knowledge that it took courage for Leon to talk then as he is talking now. It took courage sometimes because, very honestly, as you would well recognize, all of a president's advisors are not of the same mind. There were some among them who had what you might call, or what was then called, the bare shelf policy. And therefore, when one of the groups stood forth and year in and year out talked about 50 million, 60 million of employed people, of an ever-expanding economy of 2 and 3 and 4 billions of dollars, and once in a while somebody'd make a crack that he sounded like Amos and Andy. But nevertheless, he always had the courage to talk like he has been talking tonight, and I think history is very close to bearing out exactly and precisely what Leon had to say. I'd just like to supplement 2 or 3 things tonight, if I might. I missed my opportunity on the program this morning. I thought I was allowing myself ample time, but I wasn't. As a matter of fact, I began to lose faith in the weatherman, and I didn't think he was going to produce another snow or rain for a good long time. He hasn't in my part of the country. But I allowed myself just a few hours leeway, 11 o'clock till the afternoon session, and it turned out that to the south of you, and maybe many of you know it who have come from that part of the country, of your state, they've had a very excellent and fine and wet and heavy snow. So wet and heavy that none of the planes could either take off, not to mention land, on the Omaha airport from somewhere around 7 in the morning when I first got there until afternoon, when eventually one of them did get in and take off again. So that I'm not going to give you, take the time that I would have had assigned to me this morning, but I would like to just confirm 1 or 2 things in a little more detail which Mr. Kaiserling said to you in his formal remarks while he was on the air, and elaborated on a little later on. He said, as you remember, that this must be an expanding economy. And he said that we must find a way to use the abundance of agricultural production, which, through the grace of the good Lord, we have learned how to achieve and produce in this period for the first time in all of man's history. Does it ever occur to you, as American citizens living in this midst of the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, that you are a part of a group of people, you are the citizens of a nation which for the first time in all of man's history has been able to say to itself, we have a genuine abundance of food. From the very dawn of history, man has been engaged in the business of trying to feed himself. Many of you folks say grace, for example, over the meals at mealtime. And what are we doing when we say grace? We come to a table set with food, a meager amount or a bountiful amount. And we stop and we thank the good Lord that He has somehow made it possible for us to have this food on our table. That is the basic prayer of every human being who ever set foot on this earth. And it is for the first time in all of man's history achieved by the American people in the midst of the 20th century. And yet we find to the right and to the left of us people who are frightened by the fact that we have for the first time in all of man's history achieved abundance. I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we ought to all be even more thankful than the simple expression of thanks that we give at mealtime. We, instead of being frightened about abundance, instead of trying to figure out devices for cutting back our supplies, for turning ourselves and marching right back downhill and down the corridor of history, which man has fought his way up from the very dawn. We ought to be thanking the good Lord that we've got this abundance, and then turning to find means to use it to achieve the other objective of all mankind, which is a peaceful world with peace and dignity and freedom. Freedom not only in a physical sense, but freedom of thought, which is under most grievous attack on this very day and on this very occasion. Well, you say to yourself, all right, that sounds pretty good, Mr. Brannan, but what are you going to do with the butter and the cheese and the dried skim milk? What are you going to do with the corn? What are you going to do with the wheat? And one or two or three of the other things. Well, first of all, in a period of great uncertainty like you and I find ourselves in today, as far as the corn and the wheat and the feed grains and the storable foods, I don't believe we have any burdensome surplus, as I hear being said all the time. But let's say we've got a little more of some of these commodities than perhaps in a normal time we ought to have. What would we do with it? Well, let's talk about butter, for example, because I think the enemies of the price support program use the butter program as their whipping boy. That's the thing we hold up and dangle in front of the taxpayer, so-called, as if farmers aren't taxpayers too, but the city dwellers, and we say to them, look, this is the evidence of the failure of the farm program. 400 million pounds of butter, so many million pounds of cheese, and so many million pounds of dried skim milk. That proves that the price support program is wrong. Well, I don't believe it does at all. First of all, let's stop and ask ourselves, what are we supposed to be producing? What is the basic commodity, the basic dairy commodity? And of course the answer is milk. Not butter, not cheese, and not dried skim milk. The basic commodity to be supported is milk. And therefore, we ought to devote our attentions to the business of supporting the basic commodity, which is fluid milk. And see if we can find a way to get that into the hands of the consumers of this country at prices which will protect both the producer of it and give the consumer the benefit of the abundant production. And that isn't such a big job. Let's just, if you happen to have a pencil handy, just try to think of these kind of figures, because here's a good analysis. In 1950 in this country, you will all remember, we had no dairy price support program in operation. It was authorized, it was on the books, and the Secretary of Agriculture would have had to put it in force and effect if the price of milk went below 90% of parity. But it didn't during the period, the year 1950, and we produced in that year 120 billion pounds of milk. In 1951 and 2, there was some small accumulations, but in 1953, we had substantial purchases of butter, dried skim milk, and cheese in a price support operation. And in 1953, ladies and gentlemen, we had only produced 122.7 billion pounds of milk. But let's say 123 to make it so we can work with the figures without our calculator. Let's say that the difference between the year 1950 and the year 1953 is 3 billion pounds of milk. A pint's a pound the world around, so there was 1,500,000,000 quarts of milk different in 1950, between 1950 and 1953. Well, there's 165 million people in the country, but let's say there's just 150 million people. Divide 150 million into 1,500,000,000, and the answer is 10, isn't it? In other words, ladies and gentlemen, all we would have had to do in 1953 is to find a device for moving to each individual or inducing the consumption by each individual in the country, you and I and all the rest of us, of just 10 quarts of milk. Actually, it's only 8 quarts of milk. 8 quarts of milk in a whole year. Not 8 quarts in a week, not 8 quarts in a month, but just each and every one of us having consumed 8 quarts of milk in an entire year, and you wouldn't have a price support program in dairy products at all. Now, is anyone seriously going to say to himself, it is an impossible task to have found a way to move 8 quarts of milk per capita into the market in a whole year? I don't believe so. But if you want to do it on an easier basis than that, let's just remember that in September of this year, 37 million school kids went back to the elementary schools in our country. And if you'll work out that equation real quickly, and we don't need to do it here, that meant that if that 37 million school kids could increase their consumption by 40 quarts in an entire year, we would have dissipated all of this so-called surplus, all of it. And what does that amount to? 1 quart of milk per week for the 40 weeks, more or less, that kids are in school. Not a quart of milk a day, not a pint, not a half a pint of milk a day, but a quart of milk in a whole week, a fifth of a quart of milk per day, which would be something like a glass or less, for just the weeks that the children are in school. Just the elementary kids, the kids in the elementary schools, I mean. And as a matter of fact, the kids will give you a couple of pennies for it. So it wouldn't even be a loss operation in the sense that you'd be paying the distributive cost. So when someone says to me, look at this butter over here, it cannot compete with oleomargarine, and you and I must face the reality. It cannot compete with oleomargarine at, 25 cents a pound? Or even, I've seen it 2 pounds for 30 or so as a loss leader in some stores. Butter just cannot compete with it. And city folks aren't the great offenders. In the state of Vermont, which is almost exclusively dairy and livestock, but mostly dairy, where there are more cows than there are human beings in the state of Vermont, one of the highest per capita consumptions of oleomargarine in the United States, in the state of Vermont. In other words, farmers eat the oleomargarine and sell their butter in the marketplace. So that's a reality. So why do we convert our milk into a commodity, butter, which cannot compete in the marketplace with oleomargarine? Well, I know that would have been heresy to say that 10 years back, but actually none of us can fail to face the honest-to-goodness fact that the way to have moved that milk was to have moved it as milk in the marketplace. I realize there's some areas where milk won't go into the marketplace, and those are the areas which will produce the cheese, which will produce whatever dried skim milk we need, and that's a small amount. Produce the milk, produce the cheese, and produce the butter, because there'll always be a substantial demand for those commodities. But first of all, having moved this milk into the marketplace, it seems to me would have been the concentration of our effort. Well, you say, might have been difficult. Well, goodness no. You don't have to drink a quart apiece per month or less, 10 quarts in a year or 8 quarts in a year. Just a little more ice cream if we had consumed a little more ice cream, a bit more butter or cheese, a little more milk in our cooking. And honestly, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't want to eat it, just send it to the drying plant, and they'll make it into non-fat dry milk solids, or dried skim milk, as we sometimes call it. and they'll turn that into calcimine. You can paint it on the wall. You don't even need to eat it. Actually, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have a surplus. We have a scarcity of imagination and a scarcity of willingness to tackle some of these problems in their reality. Well, the second, let me just touch on one more. Let's talk about corn. We've got about 800 million bushels of corn, about 700 million bushels of corn carryover. I don't think we ought to at any time be in this country with less than 500 million bushels carryover, and maybe more than that in these uncertain times. But let's take 100 or 200 million off, and then we'd be back where we were before there was any request for acreage limitations or marketing quotas. You know how much 100 million bushels of corn, 100 million bushels of corn means per capita in meat, in beef? Well, it means just 4 5/10 pounds of meat. 4 1/2 pounds of meat per capita in this country can be manufactured out of 100 million bushels of corn and the supplemental feeds that have to go in the business. And do you say the American people wouldn't eat 4 1/2 more pounds of beef than they're eating now? Well, I'm sure that isn't right. We eat 75 pounds of beef now. We eat 150 pounds of all meats, about 75 pounds of beef, about 35 pounds of pork, about 30 pounds of poultry, and the balance of it in lamb. Do you know how much meat they ate in the Argentine per capita before Perón ruined their economy? 265 pounds per capita per year. And that was all beef, ladies and gentlemen. All of it was beef. Maybe less than a pound of it was poultry, and very, very little sheep, or very little lamb or mutton. And it was mutton and not lamb, of course, because there are wool sheep. But 100 million bushels of corn is the equivalent of 4 1/2 pounds per capita of meat to the American people. In other words, add 4 1/2 pounds on the 75 pounds per capita of beef, and we would have consumed at least 100 million. And if you add another 10 pounds per capita over a whole year, you would have our corn supply would be down where nobody in the country would be worrying about it. And we can convert it, and we can distribute it to the Americans.